This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in just a bit. At the very bottom of the Malay Peninsula sits one of the least likely countries in the world. Covering a mere 721 square kilometers, it's smaller than New York City with a population lower than that of Wisconsin. It has no agricultural land, constantly suffers water shortages, and was once notorious as nothing more than a haven for pirates. Yet this improbable state, a state with no common linguistic, ethnic, or historical identity, not only exists, it's one of the richest, most militarily powerful countries in the whole of Asia. Its name is Singapore, and it's the last surviving city-state in the world. Founded in 1819 by British adventurer Sir Stamford Raffles, Singapore grew out of a malarial swamp to become one of the greatest port cities in history. Passed variously between the East India Company, the British Crown, and Imperial Japan, Singapore finally won its independence in 1959, only to face a desperate fight to survive. It's commonly claimed by travelers that Singapore is one of the most boring places in Asia. Not where history is concerned, it isn't. Today, Singapore is famous as a high-tech, high-rise wonderland, but while you won't be surprised to hear it's changed somewhat in the last 200 years, you might be surprised to hear just how far the island has come. When Sir Stamford Raffles first set foot here on January the 29th, 1819, there was nothing to be seen. No city, no state, not even a town. Nothing but sand, swamp, and a fishing village so neglected that to call its houses shacks would be overselling things. It was in this desperate place that Raffles decided to build the Manchester of the East. Now, the fact that there was nothing there in Raffles' time doesn't mean there hadn't ever been anything there. The tip of the Malay Peninsula is a natural meeting point for merchant ships brought from China and India on warm trade winds. The island itself was first mentioned in 1349 by a Chinese scribe who claimed it was basically pirate central. Later sources talk of a settlement called Temasek, while others describe a prosperous city named Singapura. Yet the basic fact remains that this was all ancient history by 1819. After a brief period as an Islamic sultanate, the Singapore of old had been ransacked and burned by the Portuguese, leaving nothing but ruins. And ruins were what Raffles found when he came ashore that fateful day, ready to restart Singapore's history. Born on July 6, 1781, Thomas Stamford Raffles was exactly the sort of colonial adventurer the British Empire excelled at churning out. In 1811, he had made a name for himself by single-handedly annexing Java from the Dutch in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. Although the peace settlement following Napoleon's fall made Raffles hand Java back, he had already made his mark. Yet this mark had come at the cost of seriously annoying his employers. The East India Company was technically under the jurisdiction of the British Crown, but really it was so powerful that it could just do its own thing. So while the Prince Regent knighted Raffles for his work, no one was able to stop the company demoting him and shipping him off to a miserable posting as punishments for overspending in Java. It was while cooling his heels in the sweat-drenched, fever-soaked pepper port of Bengkulu that Raffles had his big idea. At the time, nearly all the ports in the Far East were owned by the Dutch, who taxed goods and offered preferential treatment to allies. There was no way that the British could compete with the Dutch at monopoly, but what if they built a new type of port, one where trade would be completely free? And that's how Raffles came to be stood on the beaches of Singapore in early 1819, convinced that he'd found his new port. Despite what you might believe, claiming places for the British Crown isn't as easy as simply sticking a flag in the ground and singing God Save the King. I've tried it, it's never worked. But it actually wasn't much more difficult. After surveying the island, Raffles located its sultan, in reality little more than a local tribal leader, and asked if he could buy the place. When the sultan said, no, Raffles was all like, fair enough. And then he basically turned to the Sultan's brother and said, "Hey, I've decided that you're the new Sultan now. Want to sell me your island?" The new Sultan, he agreed. The handover ceremony took place in a patch of rainforest, observed only by a handful of sea gypsies, and involved the new Sultan signing a load of documents that he couldn't understand. But this was enough for Raffles. On that day, the island known as Singapore passed into British hands in return for little more than a pension for one fake sultan. It would remain under London's rule for the next 144 years. When Raffles returned to Britain and was all like, "Hey guys, guess what I did?" he became more popular than ever. But once again, that popularity did not extend to the top brass of the East India Company. You see, the Dutch were super into having a trade monopoly in East Asia and kind of felt that some British arsehole founding a free port might be a little bit of an act of war. They wrote to the East India Company, who really did not want the Dutch attacking their ships, and the company ordered Raffles to abandon his Singaporean adventure. Unfortunately for the company, Britain at the time was in the grip of a sort of post-Napoleon hyper-nationalism, and they just loved the idea of sticking it to some cheese-eating continentals. London made Singapore's annexation law and feted Raffles, while the company simultaneously punished him by sending him straight back to the fever-soaked port of Bengkulu. Before Raffles died in 1826, he was only able to return to Singapore once, but it would be a significant visit. During the winter of 1822 to 1823, Raffles oversaw the expansion of Singapore. Now a heaving mess of 5,000 people, he instituted the first urban plan, one awkwardly based on racial segregation. More importantly, though, he finally announced how he envisioned this new port. "The port of Singapore is a free port, and the trade thereof is open to ships and vessels of every nation, equally and alike to all," he decreed. It would be the sentence that changed Singapore's history. So let's wind the clock forward now, past Raffles's death in 1826 and across the 19th century. As we go flitting through the years, make sure to occasionally glance out of the window of our time machine, and you'll notice the way that Singapore changes. At first, in the early part of the 19th century, you'll see Raffles's trade decree result in a booming city. But hey, look at that, the city's suddenly in a slump. For that, you can blame the British snatching Hong Kong from the Chinese and turning it into a rival free port. But see, this doesn't last. There you see, things are already booming again, this time thanks to the opening of the Suez Canal and increasing demand for rubber in Europe. And now here we finally are, slowing down our time machine as we enter the 20th century, landing in the 1930s. Why the 1930s? Well, because that's when everything is about to change. By the late 1930s, Singapore was no longer Raffles's Manchester of the East, but the Asian Gibraltar. Just like Gibraltar, a tiny British possession at the bottom of Spain, Singapore was a key defensive outpost guarding an important shipping lane. Just like Gibraltar, it was close to potentially hostile military powers. But while General Franco's Spanish fascists would never attack Gibraltar, the same cannot be said for Singapore's hostile neighbors. Some 4,000 kilometers away, a militaristic society had risen on a once peaceful island. The island had already invaded and occupied Korea, it had already taken over Manchuria, and it was now conducting a vicious, bloody war in China. That island's name, of course, was Japan. While it was currently one of Singapore's biggest trading partners, that was not destined to last. In the very near future, that partnership was going to be out, and bombs and brutality were going to be very much in. You know what's in right now? Making yourself a website, and you can do that with today's fantastic sponsor, Squarespace. Look, a couple of simple things. Maybe you've got an idea for a business or a website that you want to start, or maybe a podcast or a YouTube channel, something like that. Well, the only way to find out if that's a good idea is to go and do it, and you're probably going to want a website to make that possible. Now, obviously, trying new things can be daunting because, well, it's scary to go and try new things, but not knowing how to set up a website is not an excuse. There are no excuses available with Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to create a powerful website for whatever you're up to. You want to sell something online? Yes. Set up a store on Squarespace. Want a podcast? Yes. Squarespace as well. Starting a YouTube channel, well, obviously you do that on YouTube, but you'll want a companion website. It all starts on Squarespace with a beautiful template that you can customize to your heart's content, or just start from scratch, or move over for an existing domain. makes everything super easy to manage. But don't start from scratch. Start from something that already sort of exists, like with Singapore, except it's going to be way more beautiful, because that's how Squarespace templates are. And once you've gone through the easy customization process, there are no updates, there are no patches, there's no tech BS to deal with. They've also got 24/7 customer support, so if you do run into a snag, they're definitely going to help you out. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics, and you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Now, let's get back to it. If you're American, you've probably been taught that Japan entered World War II on December 7th, 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But if you're from Asia, you likely know that Japan got its war on much, much earlier. Things kicked off with the invasion of China in the summer of 1937, but it wasn't long before the European powers got dragged in. As early as 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, occupying parts of modern Vietnam. By August 1941, they'd marched into and effectively annexed French-administered Cambodia. As Pearl Harbor approached, it became extremely obvious that Japan was planning to overrun the entire continent. The British garrisoned their Malayan colonies, confident they could at least hold on to some of them. But this confidence would turn out to be sadly misplaced. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The very next day, the Imperial Army launched its invasion of British Malaya. By afternoon, bombs were raining down on Singapore, killing 61 in the first day alone. Before a week was out, the Japanese had established air superiority over the peninsula. As colonial forces fell before the onslaught, the British retreated back to Singapore. On December 31st, they blew up the bridges connecting Stamford Raffles City to the mainland. The British commander, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, believed he could hold out from the island. Singapore had a ring of defensive guns, and there were now tens of thousands of Allied troops stationed there. On paper, resistance looked easy, like it would take a world-class dunce to screw it up. Sadly, Arthur Percival was that world-class dunce. Despite warnings from other commanders in the field, Percival failed to predict the Japanese points of attack. The upshot was that when the Battle of Singapore began on February the 8th, the Allied troops were woefully unprepared. Within a week, it was all over. On Valentine's Day, the Imperial Army broke into Alexandra Hospital and massacred 200 patients with bayonets. Food and ammunition stores were seized and whole districts fell. Although Churchill telegrammed demanding the defenders fight to the bitter end, Percival ignored the order. On February the 15th, the Allied forces surrendered. 62,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, nearly half of whom would die in forced labor camps. It was just the first taste of the horrors that the Japanese planned to inflict on Singapore. 3 days after the fall of Singapore, February the 18th, 1942, the Japanese put out a call asking for all Chinese men aged 18 to 50 to report for inspection. Then, as now, Singapore didn't have a single ethnic identity, instead comprising a mix of straight Chinese, indigenous Malay, and Indian workers brought in by the British. While the Japanese considered them all inferior, the Chinese were the ones they thought actively worthy of extermination. Every Chinese man who responded to their call was murdered. The death toll of the Sook Ching massacre remains hotly debated. At a bare minimum, 5,000 civilians were killed by the Japanese occupiers in a few days. A more common estimate is around 25,000. It was the worst massacre ever experienced on Singaporean soil, killing more than the Battle of Singapore itself. When it was over, Singapore's survivors no longer had any illusions. The Japanese weren't friends. They weren't even colonial overlords like the British. They were here to occupy and destroy, to drive Singapore's citizens into the depths of suffering. And there was nothing that anyone could do to stop them. For tiny Singapore, World War II was a little bit like spending 3.5 years as the regional punching bag. First, the Japanese did what the Imperial Japanese do and pointlessly brutalized the inhabitants. Then, the tide turned and Allied planes started bombing the place. The 1944 to 1945 bombing of Singapore killed few civilians, but it did reduce large tracts to nothing more than dust and memories. By the time the Japanese formally handed back the territory on September the 12th, 1945, there was barely anything left to hand back. For the inhabitants of Singapore, liberation was a weird time. While everyone else was obviously super happy to get rid of the Japanese, reinstating the British, it did seem somehow rather wrong. After all, it was the British who'd surrendered Singapore in the first place. If London couldn't protect the island, well, what was the point of being a colony? Over the next decade or so, Singapore rebuilt from its wartime ruin. It was a haphazard process. Shacks and temporary structures sprang up wherever there was space, and often there wasn't any. Things got so squalid that a contemporary travel magazine declared the city was utter filth and poverty. One must see it with his own eyes to believe it. So, what happened? How did we get from Singapore being a city-sized toilet to the gleaming bidet of today? Well, for the answer to that, you can look to one man. Kuan Yew was born in Singapore on September 16, 1923. Although his parents were both ethnic Chinese, they'd been established in the port long enough that Lee grew up speaking English as his first language. Indeed, Lee's early life was colonial British to a fault. After schooling in Singapore, he was sent off to England to train as a lawyer, with the expectation that he might become a good middle-class Londoner. Instead, though, he wound up returning to Singapore at exactly the right time. By the mid-1950s, revolution was in the air. This was the era of decolonization. Britain had surrendered its claim to India, the jewel in the imperial crown, in 1947. With the empire breaking up, no one in Singapore wanted to be left as merely a backup Hong Kong. In 1955, Lee formed the People's Action Party, or PAP. Although there were only a handful of contestable seats in Singapore, Lee's new party managed to win 3 in that year's election. Flush with his triumph, Lee returned to London, certain that he could convince Britain's ruling classes that Singapore deserved freedom. But then he ran slap bang straight into the wall of British obstinacy. Not only did the British refuse Lee's request, they also cracked down hard. PAP leaders were arrested, and there were riots in Singapore. Things could have spiraled out of control. Luckily, the mood in Britain was now pro-decolonization. Rather than fight, London backed down. It was a huge victory for Lee. When he took part in Singapore's first elections as a free state, voters rewarded him by sweeping PAP to power. As Lee was sworn in on June 9, 1959, he promised to transform Singapore. The island would no longer be a dirty, impoverished swamp that Westerners sneered at. It would become a haven, an oasis of calm in a turbulent region. To do that, Lee knew he had to accomplish only one thing while in power: take Singapore into union with the rising new state of Malaysia. But while Lee would soon see his dream come true, he'd also see it smashed into a million bitter pieces. The moment Lee Kuan Yew came to power, he instituted a 5-year development plan that would make even Stalin's head spin. The key point was that Singapore needed to modernize, and fast. In a flurry of activity, Lee emancipated the island's women, began a massive slum clearance program, and created the all-powerful Housing and Development Board, which would eventually provide 80% of all housing in Singapore. Most importantly of all, though, he began negotiations on joining Malaysia. So here's a quick crash course on Malaysia. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, the British slowly came to acquire a whole lot of the Malay Peninsula, collectively known as British Malaya. Although Singapore was initially part of it, the island underwent a separate decolonization process. The result was 2 separate states with a lot of ties, and a union seemed like a natural next step. Singapore became a part of Malaysia on September 16, 1963. For Lee, this was his crowning achievement, the moment he'd spent his entire career preparing for. Sadly, things almost immediately imploded. The trouble was that PAP was an avowedly multicultural project. Lee's Singapore was all about its different ethnicities integrating and mixing and not forming enclaves. By contrast, Malaysia's ruling UMNO party was founded on the idea that Malaysia should favor indigenous Malay people, a sort of affirmative action after centuries of British oppression. It should have been obvious to everyone that these two sides would never see eye to eye. What was less obvious was just how quickly things would fall apart. Before a year had passed, hardline race rhetoric had ratcheted tensions so high that Singapore exploded into ethnic rioting. In 2 major incidents, 36 people were killed, 500 injured, and 5,000 arrested. Come summer 1965, it was clear Malaysia was about to detonate, with no one sure if UMNO or PAP would be the ones left standing when the dust settled. So Malaysia's leaders decided to rig the game in the only non-violent way they could. On August 9th, 1965, Singapore was formally ejected from its unions with Malaysia. Lee had got word only a handful of days before and had barely had time to prepare. When he addressed the cameras at 4:30 p.m. that day, he was visibly overwhelmed, tears running down his cheeks as he informed Singapore's citizens that they were now on their own. Suddenly, the port Stamford Raffles had founded so long ago was nothing but an isolated city-state, adrift in a dark and uncaring universe at the mercy of anyone from Indonesia to China. In the depths of his moment of anguish, Lee realized that it was up to him to keep his newly independent nation alive. It wouldn't be easy. It would involve doing some highly questionable things. But it would also lead to the creation of modern Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew once said of his approach to politics, "Nobody doubts that if you take me on, I will put on knuckle dusters and catch you in a cul-de-sac. There is no other way you can govern a Chinese society." And that pretty much summed up his attitude after the Malaysia fiasco. Faced with an unruly nation and no shared ethnicity, language, identity, or history, Lee decided that playtime was over. He was going to turn Singapore into a modern state, even if he had to personally beat every single inhabitant into submission. The Lee approach came with two prongs. The first was an outrageous disregard for the rights of the individual. Under Lee, free speech in Singapore was annihilated as effectively as pouring napalm over the First Amendment. Anyone who spoke out of line, be they religious extremists, Malays wanting to reunite with Malaysia, Chinese who were into communism, or people who wanted simply to talk politics, they were locked away without trial. Those who criticized the government were subjected to a litany of lawsuits designed to bankrupt them and force them to stay silent. Alongside these laws, Lee also introduced several penalties for social ills. To this day, spitting, chewing gum, public urination, graffiti, public drunkenness, and other things that we just kind of deal with in the West remain illegal in Singapore, punishable by imprisonment, enormous fines, and even public caning. It was authoritarianism, yes, but it also came from a place of paternalism. Lee was only too aware that Singapore's ethnic, religious, linguistic, and cultural differences could blow up at any moment. Like a stern parent stuck with unruly children, Lee was going to make sure that everyone played nice, or they were going to get a taste of his belt. And if anyone was hoping they could just wait until he was replaced in office, well, tough. Although Lee was a Democrat in the sense that he allowed free elections, he was also authoritarian in the sense that he knew the opposition was boycotting those elections, so he was guaranteed a landslide. Until he got bored of playing the strict dad, Lee was here to stay. The second prong was his focus on making his citizens spectacularly comfortable. Like other benevolent authoritarians, Lee gambled that his population would accept trading away freedoms in return for safety and economic prosperity. To make sure that happened, he embraced the free market as eagerly as Stamford Raffles had once done. Only this time, he did it with a Singaporean twist. Although the market was scared, the rights of indigenous workers were also protected. At the same time, an extremely powerful public sector was allowed to dominate entire industries, creating a government monopoly over everything from housing to social education. And to make sure no private elements were able to corrupt officials, Lee instituted some of the highest salaries for elected officials anywhere in the world. It was a strange mix, a weird cocktail of libertarianism and dogged socialism. It says a lot that both Margaret Thatcher and Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping were able to visit Singapore and come away convinced that this was the country they wanted to emulate. By 1990, Lee's vice-like grip had transformed the colonial port of Stamford Raffles into a towering city of the future. Singapore was now the richest country in Asia after Japan. It had the most developed military. Life expectancy had risen 9 years, while per capita income had jumped from $1,000 to nearly $20,000. The city-state had become a base of not just trade, but also manufacturing, finance, and tourism, one that was both safe and clean, but also boring and mildly authoritarian. To be honest, that's basically where things remain now. Although Lee stepped down as Prime Minister in 1990, he retained a succession of powerful posts right the way until 2011, continuing to shape the nation behind the scenes. He finally died on March 23, 2015, leaving behind both a state that openly despised personal freedoms, but also one that was safe and stable. Today, Singapore is the last true city-state left on the planet, a single sovereign city which, unlike, say, Monaco, is powerful enough to defend its borders and survive without the largesse of a larger state. It's also one of Asia's greatest success stories, a nation of 5.6 million people crammed into a space not even a quarter of the size of Rhode Island. And yet somehow, they all get along. It may not be a utopia. It may have problems with authoritarian government, draconian policing, and the treatment of migrant workers. But Singapore is a state that shouldn't exist, a city that should have either been folded into Malaysia or conquered by some regional power. That it's here at all is testimony to the vision of both Sir Stamford Raffles and Kuan Yew. Where the 21st century may take their freest of ports next is anyone's guess. And I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below. Also, check out our wonderful sponsor, Squarespace, linked to below. And thank you for watching.